Hello everyone and welcome to Genius Yoshi. Today we're talking Lorcana and learning how to evaluate a card. So a new card gets spoiled and you want to look at it and figure out whether this card is going to see play, whether it's good by itself, good synergistically with other cards, how is it going to fit with the metagame. Well, there's different ways we can look at a card, and the first thing is to evaluate it relatively to the other cards. So let's establish baselines. Let's look at the cost removals, questing. How does the lore come into play? What are the basic stats for different converted ink costs? Let's talk about card advantage and the different choices that we have. First, let's look at the removal spells that are available right now. There's two main ones. There's Dragonfire, which is a key removal spell. It's just banish chosen character, the unconditional removal of the format. And this is a format defining card in the sense that it costs 1 card and 5 ink to remove anything. So if you're removing something that costed more than 6 ink from your opponent, you've gained an ink advantage. If you're removing something that has cost 5, it's just a trade. And if you're removing something that costed 4 or less, then you're at an ink disadvantage and at a loss of tempo. Also note that this card does not have the Inkwell symbol, so it really is a hard 5 ink, banish a chosen character, no other upsides to this card. Then we have Fire the Cannon, which is on the other side of the spectrum, which is a 1-costed card, so cheapest removal you can have, which deals 2 damage to a chosen character. And what that card tells us is if a character has 2 willpower or less, it can get removed by 1 ink from your opponent, and you can be at a loss of value. It also tells us that that 3rd point of willpower actually makes your character immune to fire the cannons and increases their value. The second topic I want to go over is questing and the lore values on every card. We know that questing is how you win the game. So the lore value on the cards is quite important. And at first you might look at a card like Pascal and say, okay, this one has 1 lore value. That's alright. And Maleficent has 2. So Maleficent is slightly better because it's 1 more lore. And you'll think of it as it's just 1 more lore. But consider the amount of times you need to quest with a character that has 1 lore to win. You need to quest 20 times. And that's quite a lot of questing. Now, if you have a character with 2 lore, it only takes 10 quests to win. And considering the fact that, barring removal spells, you can't attack a character that's ready, it means that it's fairly difficult to prevent characters from questing. So if your opponent is trying to quest, and all the cards are 2 lore, then there's only 10 quest triggers to win the game. So you really shouldn't be thinking about it as 1 more lore, but think about it as twice the amount of lore. And the 2 lore cards are that much stronger than the 1 lore cards. So let's see how that scales. If you go to 3 lore, well, it takes 7 quests to win. Which, honestly, between 10 and 7, and considering that the cards that have 3 lore are fairly expensive, it's not... 3 lore is better, but it's not that much better. It's not the difference that we're seeing between 1 and 2. There's really that doubling factor here. And then you can say that between 2 and 4, you're also just reducing by half the amount of questing that you need to win the game. But as we know, right now there's only 1 8-costed card that can quest for 4. And so this should be a game-winning card, and it will still take a fair bit of time to quest. So the main thing I want you to remember from this one is that 2 lore is much better than 1 lore. 3 lore it's slightly better than 2, but 2 is that sweet spot where you're getting maximum value, and you can get 2 lore on fairly cheap cards. Next, let's take a look at some stats. And let's look at strength and willpower of different characters based on their cost. So here I've looked through the card pool that's available, and I've chosen representative stats for cards that don't have too much other effect and have similar stats. So we have a couple of 1-drops that have 2 strength and 2 willpower. We have a couple of 2-drops that have 2 power and 3 willpower, namely Minnie Mouse and Donald Duck. And we have a bunch of 3/3s in the 3 slot. So you can look at the table this way. For 1, you can have 2 2s, for 2, 2 3, 3 3 3, 4 3 4. That's a mouthful to say. But the key thing is that when they fight a 2-3 versus a 2-2, the 2-3 will live with 1 willpower, and it'll take down a 1-1. When a 2-drop will fight a 3-drop with the same stats, the 3-drop will live with 1 willpower. When the 3 fights the 4 will live with 1 willpower. And so the balance is very thin. It's a thin margin, but it's made so that the card that costs 1 more ink is actually going to survive by 1 willpower against the weaker card. And I have included cards much higher than 5 because the stats start to get a bit all over the place at this point, and it's more about the effects of the cards and how much lore they'll gain than the actual stats baseline at that point. So when you're building your deck, you need to take into account, well, first off, you need to worry about that 2 willpower. 2 willpower or less is susceptible to fire the cannons. It's also important to note that the 3 willpower is the willpower that's key to survive the assault from most 1-drops and 2-drops. And 4 willpower is the key willpower to survive assaults or challenges from 3-drops and 4-drops, allowing you to quest multiple times and still inflict damage on characters that will be wasting their time challenging your tougher characters. It's also important to note that starting from the 3 ink is when you start to see more characters have 2 lores on them. And it keeps on going for 4-drops as well as 5-drops. And we don't have that many 5-drops that have lore higher than 2. Hence, even more important that the 2 lore cards are the ones that are going to be winning you the game and scoring you the lore. Next stop, card advantage. It's very important to manage the number of cards that you have available. If your deck is all 1-drops, you're going to get a good board presence advantage early on, but you'll run out of steam if your opponent challenges a lot of your characters. So there are different ways to see card advantage. There's Magic Mirror, that's very obvious, draw card. And you can do that repeatedly. Now there is a lot of tempo that you have to sacrifice to do that, because it means that you're playing nothing on turn 2, and you need to invest 4 lore to draw the card, which means either you have nothing to play, or you're up with a lot of lore, and you have nothing to play, really. And Magic Mirror does not replace itself immediately. So until you start to pay that investment of 4 lore, you're essentially down a card in your hand. Consider another card like Hades, for example, where you get decent stat line, a bit subpar and weak to fire the cannons. But when you play the character, you get a character card from your discard pile to your hand, which is just draw a card of your choice as long as it's a character from your discard pile. And then we have Mickey Mouse, which says when you play this, put the top card of your deck in your Inkwell face down and exerted. And that's basically just playing a card in your ink pool that doesn't cost you a card, and you're left with a 1/3 Mickey Mouse on the battlefield. So the ramping ability is actually pretty good, and you're getting some poor stats on the board, but a 1/3 is actually good enough to live a couple of turns. And then we get into the decision, to Inkwell or not to Inkwell. Well, sometimes you don't have the choice. So you need to carefully consider the fact that certain cards have the Inkwell symbol, while others do not. And there's a limit to how many cards you can put that do not have the Inkwell symbol, as I explained in my how to build a good curve video, which I encourage you to watch if you haven't watched it yet. In particular, playing more cards that have the Inkwell symbol is going to give you more flexibility over what you're playing. So it's always a plus to have the Inkwell symbol. The way I look at it is that you'll want a certain number of cards with your Inkwell symbol into your deck, and then you'll want to play as many powerful cards as you want. And if it happens that most of the powerful cards don't have the Inkwell symbol, now the Inkwell cards are going to end up acting as ink most of the game, and you can adjust your curve appropriately. So I don't take it away. I don't think it's that much of a downside not to have the Inkwell symbol. It's something that you need to keep in mind during deck construction, and to balance the amount of card that you'll be putting on both sides of the pendulum. In conclusion, let's look at what we've learned from our analysis of the cards spoiled so far. We've noticed that the second point of lore is a critical value, and it allows these cards to be the cards you want to quest with, and help you win the game much faster than one lore cards. The cards with one lore you'll mostly be using for challenges. The third point of willpower is very important because it allows you to survive the assault of most 1-drops and 2-drops, and it allows you to survive Fire to Cannon, which is one of the main cheap removal spells in the format. Then you want to be reminded of the 5 ink cost, which is the clean, unconditional removal spell in the format. If your card costs more than 5 ink, you need to make sure you're getting some good value out of it. Either you're going to win the game off of it, or you're going to get some value that your opponent can't remove. So when you play the card, you get some good value, and even if your opponent removes it, it doesn't matter so much. Which is why I think our curves should likely stop around 5 or 6 ink, unless there are some very powerful cards that are stronger. Next, effects and flexibility of the cards is oftentimes more valuable than stats. It's something that I haven't talked about that much, but a card that gives you card advantage is worth sacrificing some stats over. You don't want to have just a bunch of beater cards in your deck with no abilities. Sometimes a collection of weaker cards that has good synergy between them is actually going to end up more powerful than the cards actually looked like individually. So that's always something to keep in mind. And last is the impact of a card. When you play a card, what does it give you? I'll take this Mickey Mouse, for example. You've invested 8 ink. You've sacrificed cards to your ink pool in order to play Mickey Mouse. And when you play Mickey Mouse, your opponent's board remains exactly the same, and your opponent is free to quest and perhaps end the game, since turn 8 is actually fairly late. So Mickey Mouse is a card that has no immediate impact on the battlefield. Well, the main impact is that it threatens the quest for 4 and it's evasive, which can be game ending. So you have to look at what is the card going to bring me now, especially with the fact that we can't challenge ready characters. You're really making investments into your future turns with most of the cards. That's where some of the removal spells come in and give you immediate value on the battlefield by removing an opponent's card. And that's it. These are the things I wanted to talk about when it comes to analyzing the value of a card and how good it can be in the game of Lorcana. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, add a comment, and please subscribe to the channel to see a lot more cool Lorcana videos.